When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, but not from fear of being caught. It was because of those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I lunged for the phone, but he yanked it back with surprising speed, his eyes locked on the screen. I watched his face change, line by line, message by message, and felt my life collapse in real time. Yes, he was about to find out the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew he was approaching the message. The one that would ruin everything. The one that would explain it all or twist it beyond recognition. My phone suddenly vibrated in his hands, and a new notification flashed across the screen. I saw the blood drain from his face as he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a nervous habit I never kicked. My anxiety mixed with a suffocating dread. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even across the 2 feet that now felt like miles. This was what I feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake that changed everything. And now. I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it all began. Before I share the secret I worked so hard to bury, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever had a secret you tried to hide with all your might, but failed? I used to believe that routine was safety. That a quiet kitchen at 7 a.m., the hum of the coffee machine, the clink of ceramic mugs, all of that meant stability. Security. Love. But over time, that same kitchen became a reminder of everything I wasn't feeling. Of everything I wasn't anymore. I still made his coffee every morning. 2 sugars, no cream. Just like always. And every morning, he thanked me without looking up. The words left his mouth on autopilot, like brushing teeth or tying shoelaces. I stopped waiting for eye contact weeks ago. He sat by the window with his phone, already scrolling through the news while I stood in my robe, sipping my own cup. I watched him the way you'd watch a stranger, not out of curiosity, but out of disbelief that you ever shared a bed, a life, a history. His hair was thinning more these days. His shoulders stooped in a way they didn't used to. But it wasn't age that distanced us. It was silence. The kind that accumulates quietly until one day it fills every room and leaves you gasping. That morning, I lingered by the window longer than usual. Outside, the sky was still deciding whether it would rain. Light broke through the clouds in slices, highlighting patches of our garden, dry and neglected. And just beyond our hedge, in the neighbor's yard, he appeared. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and shorts, carrying a toolbox. Something about the way he moved, casually confident, like he didn't need to prove anything to anyone, caught my eye. He crouched near the walkway light, unscrewing the casing. I pretended to water the plants just to stay outside longer, even though most of them didn't need it. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. A glance? A wave? A reason? He noticed me, eventually. Looked up and smiled. Not the polite, distant kind you give your neighbor. A real smile. One that lingered. One that made me forget what I was doing for a moment. Morning, he said, nodding toward my hydrangeas. They're surviving better than mine. I laughed, surprised by the sound of my own voice. Neglect seems to be working. He wiped his hands on his shirt. That, or they like being ignored. It wasn't flirtation. Not really. But it felt like something. And that was enough to carry me through the rest of the day, and into the next morning, and the one after that. By Thursday, I found myself opening the blinds earlier. Fixing my hair before taking the trash out. Choosing fitted jeans over my usual yoga pants. I told myself it was nothing. That it's normal to crave interaction, to miss being seen. And it was just that, being seen. It had been so long. My husband didn't notice the subtle changes. Not the mascara. Not the way I lingered by the front porch. He came home, ate, asked about bills and errands. Sometimes, he'd touch my shoulder in passing, like I was furniture. Functional, familiar. I didn't resent him for it. That's the saddest part. I just accepted it. Saturday morning came and I couldn't shake the restlessness. There was a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. I needed to move. To feel something. On a whim, I grabbed my old rollerblades from the hall closet. The last time I'd used them was a decade ago, probably longer. I laced them up on the porch steps, laughing at myself for even trying. But I needed to feel my body again. To prove it still worked. The pavement felt foreign beneath my feet, my balance unsteady. I circled the driveway once, twice, then made the mistake of heading toward the street slope. Halfway down, I lost control. My ankle twisted, sharp pain shooting up my leg as I tumbled onto the grass. I cursed under my breath, clutching my foot. The world spun for a second, embarrassment pulsing hotter than the pain. And then I heard footsteps. "Hey, are you okay?" It was him. The neighbor. I looked up, and he was already kneeling beside me, eyes scanning my leg. "You fell hard." "I'm fine," I muttered, wincing. He didn't believe me. "Can you stand?" I tried. Failed. He offered his arm. I hesitated, but only for a second. He helped me to my feet, his arm strong and warm under mine. We walked slowly toward my house. My robe flapped open at the hem where I hadn't tied it well. I tightened it instinctively, aware of everything, the brush of his hand, the smell of sweat and grass, the heat radiating between us. Inside, he guided me to the kitchen chair, knelt again, and examined my ankle. "I don't think it's broken. But you should ice it." I nodded, feeling a flush creep up my neck. He stood to grab a bag of frozen peas from the freezer, like he'd done it before. Like he belonged. We talked for a while. Nothing deep. But his eyes stayed on mine longer than they should have. He made a joke about my daring athleticism. I laughed too loudly. He smiled softly, and in that moment everything felt quieter than it should have. Even my guilt. He stood to leave. I followed him to the door. He opened it. The sunlight hit his face just right. I opened my mouth to say something, I don't remember what. And then, it happened. We kissed. He left before I could think. Or breathe. And I stood there, staring at the closed door, wondering what I'd just done, and why a part of me didn't regret it. The hours that followed felt like a quiet avalanche. I moved through the house like someone who had just come back from a place they weren't supposed to be. Every room felt unfamiliar, like someone had rearranged my life while I was gone for 10 minutes. My ankle still ached, but I barely noticed it. The echo of the kiss, the weight of it, the impossibility of it, lingered in the walls. My husband was still asleep when I passed the bedroom door. I paused, hand on the frame, listening for any sign that he might have woken. But the room was silent, the kind of silence that feels permanent. I watched his sleeping form for a moment, felt a flicker of guilt crawl up my spine, and then turned away. I wasn't ready to face him, not yet. Maybe not ever. I tried to distract myself. I loaded the dishwasher, folded towels, wiped the kitchen counters twice even though they were already clean. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept circling back. Not just to the kiss, but to what it meant. Or didn't mean. It wasn't just an accident. It wasn't a joke. It had weight, consequence. And yet, it felt strangely inevitable. I kept hearing his voice. Not the words, but the way he'd said them. Casual. Calm. As if none of it shocked him. As if he'd been waiting for that moment and simply stepped into it like one steps into a warm room from the cold. I didn't know what unsettled me more, the fact that he kissed me, or the fact that I didn't stop him. By mid-morning, I couldn't stay inside any longer. I needed air, space, something to break the loop of thoughts that were strangling me. I slipped on a coat and stepped into the garden, limping slightly but not enough to turn back. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, and the world had that wet smell it always has after a night of light rain, a mix of damp earth and leaf rot and something clean underneath it all. I trimmed a few overgrown branches near the fence, more for the sake of doing something than necessity. And then I heard movement next door. The sound of a screen door creaking open, footsteps on gravel. I didn't turn around right away, but I felt it, his presence. That same calm, self-assured energy. I stood still for a moment, unsure if I wanted him to come closer or disappear entirely. "You're up and moving," he said behind me, voice soft but clear. I turned. He was a few feet away, standing near the shared hedge, hands in the pockets of his hoodie. His face was unreadable. "Barely," I said. "Ankles sore." He nodded. "You should stay off it." I needed fresh air. A pause stretched between us, not awkward, but charged. Like we both knew what not to say. I kept my eyes on the clippers in my hand, turning them over slowly, then placing them on the ledge beside me. "I'm sorry," he said finally. That startled me. I looked up. "For what?" "For crossing a line." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to accept the apology. Another part, the louder one, wanted to dismiss it entirely. It wasn't just him. I had stepped into that moment too. With both feet. Maybe even before he did. "I didn't stop you," I said quietly. He looked at me for a long time, then gave a single, slow nod. "Still. I shouldn't have put you in that position." "You didn't," I said. "It wasn't a position. It was a moment." He didn't answer. Just watched me for a beat longer, then stepped back toward his yard. "Take care of that ankle," he said, almost as an afterthought. I nodded, and he disappeared. I spent the rest of the day somewhere between numb and restless. Every task I tried to do, laundry, sorting the junk drawer, even organizing the fridge, fell flat. I couldn't stay with anything longer than 5 minutes. Everything reminded me of something else. Everything led back to the same place. My husband came home from the store around 4, carrying 2 bags and a bottle of wine. That surprised me. We didn't drink wine during the week. It used to be something we did on date nights. But date nights had faded out like everything else. He placed the bag on the counter. "Thought we could make pasta tonight," he said. I stared at him. "Pasta?" "Yeah. I found that sauce you like. Figured we could sit outside, enjoy the weather." It wasn't like him. Not recently. For a second, panic flared in me. Had he seen something? Heard something? Was this a test? But his face looked relaxed. Normal. Almost hopeful. "Okay," I said. We cooked together, the way we used to. Chopping garlic, sautéing onions, moving around each other in a silent rhythm that once came so naturally. At one point, his hand brushed mine when we reached for the same spoon. We both froze for a second. He gave a small smile. I returned it, or tried to. We ate on the patio, watching the sky fade from gray to a soft, dusty blue. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. I kept waiting for something to break it, a wrong word, a sudden question, a look that lasted too long. But none came. He asked about my ankle. I lied and said it barely hurt. He poured more wine. I drank it. And all the while, I felt like a glass that had cracked down the center. Still whole, but only just. That night, after he went to bed, I stood by the window in the dark, looking across the hedge. His lights were off. No sound from next door. Nothing but the hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I thought about deleting our messages. But there weren't any. Nothing to delete. That made it worse, somehow. It meant everything that had happened existed only in memory, raw and unfiltered. I pressed my forehead to the glass and closed my eyes. I didn't know what I wanted. Not then. All I knew was that something had shifted. Irreversibly. And whatever came next, I wouldn't be able to go back to before. Not really. Even if everything stayed the same on the surface, I had crossed a line inside myself. Quietly. Without drama. Without noise. But with full awareness. And that was the part that scared me most. Sunday arrived with the kind of sky that couldn't decide whether to brighten or pour. The light shifted hour by hour, casting long shadows in the kitchen as I moved through the morning like someone walking underwater. There was no rush, no plans. My husband had taken the day to rest, and I pretended I was doing the same. But my mind never slowed. It played everything back, over and over. The kiss. His face. The silence after. The words we didn't say. I vacuumed the entire downstairs, even under the couch, where dust had lived peacefully for months. I rearranged the bookshelves. I repotted a dying fern in the hallway. I wanted control, order, some way to prove to myself that I still had a grip on my own life. But every clean surface only reflected back the chaos I was trying to bury. In the early afternoon, I opened the windows, hoping the fresh air would do something, anything, to clear the pressure behind my eyes. The breeze carried the scent of grass and damp earth, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of a lawnmower buzzed in the distance. I leaned on the windowsill, scanning the quiet street, and felt a subtle jolt when I saw him. He was walking toward the mailbox, a baseball cap pulled low, earbuds in. No eye contact. No wave. Just an ordinary man on an ordinary Sunday, checking his mail. And yet, my chest tightened. My breath caught for half a second. Because even from across the yards, my body still remembered the proximity. The way he'd looked at me. The way I'd let him. I closed the window and stepped back, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. How visible. I moved to the back of the house and curled up on the sunroom couch, the same one where we used to drink tea on lazy weekends. Now it just felt like a neutral zone, somewhere I could sit without being accused by furniture. My husband came downstairs a little later, yawning and scratching the back of his neck. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I nodded, even though my ankle still throbbed slightly. The idea of movement, of putting space between myself and the house, appealed to me. We walked in silence at first, down the quiet sidewalks lined with homes that all looked like ours, familiar, worn, safe. He pointed out a house that had recently been painted, made a passing comment about how we should probably think about doing the same. I nodded. Said maybe in the spring. He mentioned a neighbor who was selling his car. Wondered aloud if it was worth considering. I gave vague, non-committal answers, afraid that any real engagement might open doors I wasn't ready to walk through. Eventually, he turned to me and asked how I was feeling. It was the first real question he'd asked in days. I told him I was fine. That the ankle was healing. That I just hadn't been sleeping well. He nodded slowly. You've been quiet. I shrugged. Just tired. Another pause stretched between us. He didn't push. And I didn't offer more. We walked a bit further, then turned back toward home, where everything waited exactly as we'd left it, too orderly, too calm. That evening, after dinner, he went up to take a shower. I stood at the sink, washing dishes, when I heard a light knock on the back door. It was soft, almost uncertain. I froze, my hands submerged in the soapy water. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again. I dried my hands and walked slowly to the door, heart pounding with every step. When I opened it, he stood there, the neighbor, his expression unreadable. He looked tired. More serious than I'd seen him before. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "I just wanted to check on your ankle." I glanced behind me, as if expecting someone to appear in the hallway, though I knew no one would. I stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind me. "It's getting better," I said. We stood in the dimming light, the sky above us now fully surrendered to gray. Neither of us said anything for a moment. There was a tension in the air, not hostile, but charged. Like a string pulled taut between us. "I wasn't going to come by," he said finally. "I thought maybe it was best to just let things be." I nodded slowly. "Maybe it is. But I haven't stopped thinking about it," he added. "About you." I looked away, focusing on the way the ivy curled around the corner of the fence. My voice felt small when I spoke. "I haven't either." He stepped a little closer, but not too close. "Not like before." "I know this is complicated," he said. "I'm not trying to make it worse." "You didn't," I said, and surprised myself with how certain I sounded. "This isn't on you." We stood there for another moment, the weight of our choices pressing down like weather. Then he stepped back. "I won't bother you," he said. I just needed to say that out loud. I nodded again. "Thank you." And then he was gone, walking quietly across the yard, disappearing behind his door. I stayed outside for a while longer, sitting on the steps with my arms wrapped around my knees. I listened to the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling in for the night, televisions flickering behind curtains, dogs barking distantly, the occasional sound of laughter from a nearby backyard. Inside, my husband called down to ask if I wanted tea. I told him I'd be up soon. My voice didn't shake. I was becoming good at that. Later, in bed, he reached for my hand. It startled me, not because of the gesture itself, but because of how foreign it felt. I let him hold it. His thumb brushed over my knuckles in slow, absent circles. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine that this was enough. That it had always been enough. But my mind drifted back to the yard. To the look on the neighbor's face. To the way he didn't ask for anything, just acknowledged what had already happened. And I realized something then. It wasn't just about being seen. It was about being recognized. Not as a wife. Not as a caretaker or a woman who remembered to buy paper towels and schedule dental cleanings. But as someone whole. Someone still capable of change, of conflict, of desire, even if it scared her. Especially because it scared her. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't have a plan. But I knew this, nothing about my life could go back to how it was. Because now, I was awake. And I didn't know how to fall back asleep. The following days unfolded in quiet, deliberate slowness. I moved through them like someone performing an old play, one I had memorized long ago. My movements were automatic, the morning coffee, the folded laundry, the quick check of the mailbox, the half-hearted meal planning. Each task filled the space between thoughts I didn't want to think. It was easier to stay busy, to act like nothing had changed, easier, but not truthful. But even lies told to yourself need maintenance. They unravel in the smallest ways, the way your hand hesitates on a doorknob, the way your breath catches when you hear footsteps on gravel, the way you wake up too early and find yourself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window without knowing how you got there. I had stopped looking for him, or at least, that's what I told myself. The reality was more subtle. I no longer waited by the window, but I noticed when his car wasn't parked outside. I didn't linger in the garden, but I felt a pulse of electricity whenever I heard a door open next door. He had gone quiet, and I didn't know whether to be relieved or disappointed. One afternoon, I decided to walk to the park. My ankle had healed enough, and the house felt too tight, like the walls were inching inward. I needed air. I needed distance, from him, from my husband, from myself most of all. The park wasn't large, but it had a path that looped through a shaded grove and a small duck pond that always felt out of place, like someone had dropped a piece of another town into ours. It was quiet, aside from the occasional jogger or a parent herding toddlers. I sat on a bench beneath a tree that still hadn't fully shed its summer leaves. The sunlight flickered through them in patches, dancing across my arms and legs like something trying to wake me up. I thought about calling a friend. I thought about pretending I was fine. But I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to explain or confess or pretend to need advice. I just wanted stillness. I wanted to sit in a place where no one expected anything from me. As I watched the ducks move across the water in lazy circles, a shadow fell across the ground near my feet. I didn't look up immediately, I was afraid to. But then I heard his voice. "Didn't expect to see you here." I looked up. He was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, hands in his pockets. His tone was gentle, not surprised, just quiet. "I needed air," I said. He nodded and gestured toward the bench. I shifted slightly to make room, and he sat beside me, careful to leave space between us. That space felt necessary, like a boundary we both understood but neither of us named. For a while, we just sat in silence, watching the pond. A breeze picked up, scattering a few leaves across the path in front of us. It could have been any ordinary afternoon, any two people sitting side by side without a shared history. But the tension between us was as real as the bench beneath us. "I've been thinking," he said eventually, not looking at me. "About the other night." My stomach tightened, but I kept my face still. "I haven't regretted it," he continued. "But I haven't stopped thinking about what it meant." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't ready. I didn't even know what I thought, not really. I had spent so long trying to suppress the memory that pulling it into the light now felt dangerous, like it might catch fire and consume everything around it. "I don't know what it meant," I said finally. "I just know it happened." "That's honest," he said. Honest. The word struck something in me. I had built my life on politeness, on half-truths that made things easier. Honesty felt raw, risky. But he didn't flinch from it. He turned slightly, finally looking at me. "I don't want to make your life harder." "You didn't," I said. "Or maybe you did. But not in the way you think." He waited, sensing I had more to say. "It's not about you," I continued. "It's about me. About everything I've ignored for too long. You just showed me it was still there." He nodded, slowly. "The part of you that wants more." "Yes." We sat in silence again, not needing to fill it this time. There was a kind of relief in having said it out loud, in admitting to someone else, and to myself, that I wanted more. That I missed being seen, being known, being touched in a way that wasn't routine. Eventually, he stood. "I should go." I nodded, and he turned to leave. But before he stepped away, he paused. "For what it's worth, I see you. Even when you're trying to disappear." And then he was gone. I stayed on the bench long after he left. His words echoed in my mind, not in a romantic way, but in a grounding one. It was strange to feel more understood by a neighbor I barely knew than by the man I had built a life with. But it wasn't just about being noticed. It was about being understood without explanation. When I finally walked home, the sun was beginning to set. The light had that soft, golden haze that made everything look nostalgic. I passed familiar houses, familiar mailboxes, familiar fences. But they all felt slightly different, as if I were seeing them through new eyes. At home, my husband was sitting in the living room, reading. He looked up as I entered. "Did you get some air?" "Yes," I said. "It helped." He nodded and returned to his book. I stood in the hallway for a moment, watching him. There was nothing wrong with him. That was the hardest part. He was a good man, a decent partner. But somewhere along the way, we had both fallen asleep inside our marriage. We had stopped choosing each other. That night, as we got into bed, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. He reached for my hand again, and I let him. But my thoughts were far away, not with another man, but with another version of myself. One I had buried. One that was slowly beginning to resurface. The woman who once felt things deeply. The woman who had stopped asking herself what she needed. The woman who now couldn't stop asking. I didn't know what would come next. I wasn't ready for decisions or declarations. But I knew I couldn't go back. Not to pretending. Not to silence. Something inside me had changed. And no matter how much I wanted to smooth the wrinkles back into the fabric of my life, I knew they were there now, and they weren't going away. The days that followed that encounter in the park felt like a slow unraveling. I had no choice but to keep going, to move through the motions of my life. But every action felt like it was being performed by someone else. The laundry, the grocery store, the conversation with my husband about his new work project. I did it all, but my mind, my heart, they were somewhere else entirely. In the evenings, when the house grew quiet and the sun set low behind the trees, I would sit in the living room and watch the shadows stretch across the floor, the same way they had always done. But they felt different now, as if they were hiding something I couldn't see. My husband didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care to. His attention was elsewhere, focused on his laptop or the sports channel playing on the television. His world remained the same, comfortable, predictable. And I had become someone I didn't recognize. I could feel it in the way I moved through the house, in the way I looked at him when he spoke, in the way I no longer listened the same way. One evening, after dinner, he suggested we watch a movie. It had been a while since we did something together, as he put it. I nodded absently and let him choose the film, not caring either way. I wasn't interested in the movie, I was interested in the space between us, in the silence that had grown thick and unspoken. We settled into the couch, the usual distance between us, and I tried to focus on the film. But my mind kept drifting, back to the park, to the neighbor, to that conversation we'd had. To the way he had looked at me, really looked at me, as if he saw something I had buried long ago. And as the movie droned on, I felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping over me. A longing, not for anything specific, but for something more, for something deeper than this quiet life of routine, than the stifling comfort of a marriage that had gone cold without anyone acknowledging it. It was a hunger, not for him, but for me. For who I used to be, for the person I was before I became invisible. I shifted on the couch, trying to shake the feeling. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. I excused myself to the bathroom, not wanting him to notice the tension in my body, the tightness in my chest. Once in front of the mirror, I stared at my reflection, trying to find the woman I had once been. The one who had dreams, who had desires. The one who didn't settle for routine. But that woman seemed so far away, buried under layers of time, of responsibilities, of the woman I had become. I washed my face, splashing cold water on my skin, trying to clear my mind. But it wasn't the water that cleared me. It was the thought that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as lost as I had believed. I went back to the living room. He was still on the couch, half watching the movie, his attention elsewhere. I sat beside him, and for the first time in a long time, I wanted to reach out. I wanted to touch him, to feel some connection, to remind myself that I wasn't just a body in the room with him. But I didn't. I sat quietly, my hand on my lap, my body pressed against the cushions. At some point, I dozed off. The movie had ended, the credits rolling silently across the screen. I woke up, disoriented, to find him gone. He had gone to bed, leaving me alone in the darkened living room, the faint hum of the television still playing in the background. I walked upstairs and entered our bedroom. He was already in bed, the covers pulled up to his chin. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him sleep. He looked peaceful, unbothered by the distance that had grown between us. He didn't feel the shift that was happening inside me. I envied him for it. I undressed quietly and slipped under the covers beside him. The warmth of his body felt foreign. His breathing was slow, steady. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. About the neighbor. About what it meant. Or what it didn't mean. I didn't know anymore. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I woke up, it was morning. He was already up, getting ready for work. I rolled over, eyes half open, and watched him go through the motions of getting dressed, of tying his shoes, of fixing his tie. He kissed me goodbye, the same kiss he had given me for years. Quick, familiar, absent. And I let him go. I watched him leave the house, just like every other morning, but something inside me had already changed. I had seen too much, felt too much to pretend it was all the same. I stood by the window, watching his car pull out of the driveway, and then I turned back to the house. Everything was the same. Everything, except for the space inside me that was no longer empty, no longer silent. The phone buzzed on the counter. I hadn't realized I'd left it there, but I knew who it was before I even looked. The message from the neighbor was simple, "Are you okay?" I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the keys. I wanted to reply, to tell him everything I couldn't say aloud, to explain the quiet storm inside me. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I put the phone down, turned away, and stepped out into the morning. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I needed something different. Something real. Something that made me feel alive again. I walked through the house, room by room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I ran my hand along the countertops, touched the books on the shelves, the curtains that hadn't been changed in months. I was trying to find something, anything, that would tell me I wasn't completely lost. But there was nothing. Just the quiet. Just the space between us, growing wider with every passing day. I stepped outside and walked to the edge of the yard. The grass beneath my feet felt solid, real. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with fresh air, trying to shake the restlessness that clung to me like a shadow. And then, I saw him. He was standing at his door, watching me, waiting. He didn't say anything. Didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes on me, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't know what I wanted, or what I was supposed to do. But I knew, in that moment, that something had shifted. That nothing could stay the same. And it was terrifying. But it was also freeing. The next few days felt like I was caught in the pull of a tide, not moving forward, not retreating, but swaying in place. I spent more time in the garden, pulling weeds that had started to overtake the flower beds, clearing the walkway of leaves and debris. Everything I did felt mechanical, as though the motions were meant to keep me anchored, keep me from drifting too far into the currents of my own mind. My husband didn't notice, or maybe he did, but didn't want to ask. The silence between us had grown so natural it didn't feel strange anymore. There were still moments when he would speak to me about work, about the news, but the connection was shallow, as if we were talking through a layer of glass. We were both just going through the motions, pretending we were okay, pretending everything was fine. The neighbor, too, had fallen into the same quiet rhythm. The brief moments we shared in passing, the small glances exchanged across the yard, had become routine. There was an unspoken understanding between us, an acknowledgement of the space we were both occupying. We didn't talk much, but I could feel him there, just on the other side of the fence, his presence like a quiet hum. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that I saw him again, this time outside his house. He was bent over a small tool in his hand, adjusting something on the side of his car. I had just finished my work in the garden and, instinctively, I found myself walking toward the fence. My heart quickened with each step, though I tried to tell myself I was simply checking on something in the yard, nothing more. But I knew better. He straightened up when he saw me, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp, taking me in. I forced a smile, my fingers tightening around the gardening gloves I had yet to remove. "Everything okay?" I asked, though the question felt hollow even as I spoke it. "Yeah, just some small repairs. The car's been acting up lately." He shrugged, tossing the rag aside. "Nothing serious." I nodded, unsure of what to say next. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged with everything unsaid. I wasn't sure if he was waiting for me to speak or if he, too, was caught in this strange limbo we had created between us. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said finally, his voice lower than before. He wasn't looking directly at me, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders tightened with each word. "I don't know what I said," I replied, but the words felt like a lie. I knew exactly what he meant. We both knew what had been said, what had been felt, even if we hadn't spoken it aloud. "About the kiss," he added, his voice barely a whisper. I looked away, my gaze falling to the ground as I tried to steady myself. "We don't need to talk about that." "Don't we?" he asked, and for the first time in days, his eyes locked onto mine, full of something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, or even frustration. It was something raw, something vulnerable. I swallowed hard, struggling to find my words. "I don't know what you want from me." "I want you to be honest with yourself," he said. "And with me." His words lingered in the air, hanging there like an invitation. But what was I supposed to say? What was there to be honest about? The truth felt too dangerous, too fragile to touch. And yet, I could feel it pressing against my ribs, threatening to spill out. "I don't know what I want," I admitted quietly, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. "I haven't known for a long time." He didn't respond at first. Instead, he took a small step closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have to know everything right now. But you deserve to know something. You deserve to know that you're not alone in feeling this way." The words hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't used to being seen like this, not by him, not by anyone. But there it was, this unspoken truth between us. I wasn't invisible, not entirely. He saw me. And I saw him, too. I wanted to say something, to explain, to pull back from this dangerous territory we were both walking through. But instead, I stood there, silent, my heart beating too loudly in my chest. "I'll let you get back to it," I said finally, my voice tight with the weight of everything I wasn't saying. I turned to walk back toward the house, my feet dragging with the burden of unspoken words. He didn't stop me. But as I reached the door, I heard him call out one last time. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." I didn't look back. I couldn't. Instead, I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, shutting out everything, him, the words, the feeling that had begun to settle in my chest. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough to stop the storm that had already started. The house felt too quiet, too still. My husband was still at work, probably buried in emails and meetings. I had the entire afternoon to myself, and yet it felt like I was walking through a fog, unable to see clearly. I stood in the kitchen, looking out the window, my hands resting on the countertop. The silence was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for me to make a decision. It wasn't the first time I had thought about leaving, about stepping away from everything I knew, but it was the first time I felt like it might actually be possible. The idea had always seemed too far-fetched, too dangerous, but now it lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. The possibility of change, of something different, something real. I wasn't sure if it was a way out or just a way forward, but in that moment, the thought of remaining the same, trapped in this cycle of routine and silence, seemed like the worst option of all. I thought about the neighbor again. About his words. About the way he had looked at me, not with judgment or expectation, but with understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered what it would be like to stop pretending. To stop hiding from the things I wanted, from the person I used to be. It was a terrifying thought. But also, somehow, it was the only one that felt real. I knew I couldn't go back to how things had been. I had already crossed that line. But where I would go from here, what I would do, that was the question I couldn't yet answer. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to make a decision yet. Not today. But soon. The storm inside me wasn't done yet. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep it contained. The next few days blurred together. My thoughts remained fragmented, like broken glass scattered across a darkened room, and I was too afraid to step inside and put it all together. I moved through each day as though I were playing a role I had gotten too good at. I still cooked, still cleaned, still smiled when my husband spoke to me, but none of it felt real anymore. I was becoming a stranger to myself, a shadow walking through the motions of a life I no longer recognized. My husband continued to talk about work, about his upcoming trip, about trivial matters that no longer seemed to matter. It was easier to listen, to nod, to pretend I cared. Easier than facing the truth, than admitting that we had both fallen into a pattern we could no longer sustain. By Thursday afternoon, I felt the need to escape. It wasn't physical, not at first. It was a longing to step outside my own skin, to shed the layers of duty, expectation, and routine that had been weighing me down. I needed space to think, to breathe without suffocating in the small world I had built around myself. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The air was sharp with the first hints of autumn, and the sky was overcast, the clouds thick and heavy. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to move, to put distance between myself and the house. Between myself and everything that had become a lie. The walk took me nowhere and everywhere at once. My feet carried me through the familiar streets, past houses I had seen 1,000 times, but somehow they all seemed new, as though I were seeing them for the first time. I passed the park, the small cafe on the corner, the grocery store. None of them seemed to matter. My thoughts, however, were consumed by one thing. One person. The neighbor. It was a thought I had tried to bury, to push aside every time it crept into my mind. But it was there, unshakable, a constant companion. The way he had looked at me. The way he had spoken to me. It was different. It was more than I had ever felt with my husband in years. And that scared me. It was dangerous. But it was also alive. It made me feel something, anything. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. And I couldn't stop wondering what might happen if I let myself feel that again. If I allowed myself to want something beyond what I had. Beyond what was safe. I had been walking for over an hour when I found myself in front of his house. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't meant to end up here. But there I was, standing on the sidewalk across from his driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was closed, the lights inside dim. Everything seemed still, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I hesitated. I should leave. I should turn around and walk away, back to the life I knew, to the comfort of routine. But something inside me rebelled against the thought. It wasn't enough anymore. The life I had built, the life that had once seemed so secure, felt suffocating. I needed more. I needed to feel alive again. Before I could talk myself out of it, my feet moved on their own, carrying me across the street and up the driveway. I didn't know what I expected, maybe a conversation, maybe just the sound of his voice. Maybe I needed to hear something to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. I reached the door and knocked. The sound of my knuckles against the wood was loud in the quiet air, and for a moment, I thought I might turn around and leave. But the door opened before I could make that choice. He was standing there, looking at me with that same calm, unreadable expression. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, as if waiting for me to speak. I didn't know where else to go, I said before I could stop myself. The words came out rushed, almost frantic. He didn't move, didn't say anything for a moment. Then, slowly, he stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in." I hesitated, just for a moment. But then I stepped over the threshold, into his home. The familiar scent of coffee and cedar wood filled the air, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. The warmth of the house wrapped around me, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. "I wasn't expecting you," he said, his voice low, a touch of surprise in it. But there was no judgment, no reprimand. Just curiosity. "I didn't expect to come," I replied, not fully understanding why I had. But now that I was here, I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay in this moment, in this space where I didn't have to pretend. He motioned toward the couch, and I sat down, feeling the weight of the decision I had just made settle on my shoulders. There was no turning back now. I had crossed a line, and I knew it. But I didn't know what to do with the consequences yet. I didn't know what would happen next. He sat beside me, but there was distance between us. The space was still there, unspoken but undeniable. We didn't touch, didn't move closer. We just sat in the quiet, each of us wrestling with our own thoughts, our own reasons for being here. "I don't know what I'm doing," I said after a while, my voice small, almost lost in the room. "I don't think anyone does," he replied. "But you're here. And that counts for something." I looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was softer than I remembered, his eyes less guarded. There was something about him that made me feel like I wasn't invisible, like I mattered, not because I was someone's wife, not because of my role in a household, but because I was just me. "I don't know what I want," I said again, this time with more certainty. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "You don't have to know everything right now. But you deserve to know something. You deserve to know that you're not alone in this." The words hit me harder than I expected. It was as though he had opened a door I had been too afraid to walk through. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. Even if it was the wrong one. I stood up suddenly, the need to move overwhelming. "I should go." He looked at me, but didn't stop me. "Whenever you're ready." And so I left. I walked out the door, down the driveway, and back to the house that felt so empty now. But I wasn't the same person who had walked out that door. I had made a choice. And whatever came next, I was ready to face it. For the first time, I felt like I was finally living, not just existing. And I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it was the first step toward something real. The next morning, the house felt colder than usual. I stood in the kitchen, wrapping my hands around a cup of coffee, trying to warm them, but the chill didn't leave my fingers. Outside, a light fog blanketed the street, softening the outlines of everything it touched. I watched the neighbor's house through the mist, not looking for movement, but aware of the space between us like an ache in a muscle you didn't know you had until it tensed. My husband sat at the dining table, laptop open, already buried in his workday before the clock even struck 8. His forehead creased in concentration as he scrolled through his inbox, sipping coffee absent-mindedly. I used to find comfort in his consistency, his rituals, his unwavering sense of routine. But now it felt like a wall, one that had been there the whole time, and I was only now realizing I'd built a matching one on my side. He asked if I had plans for the day. I said I might run a few errands. He nodded, barely looking up. That was it, the entire conversation for the morning. No questions, no tension, just a polite exchange of logistical facts between two people who had stopped seeing each other long ago. I went upstairs to shower, letting the hot water run longer than necessary. It didn't wash away the weight pressing against my chest, but at least it gave me a place to breathe. I dressed slowly, choosing jeans and a sweater I hadn't worn in years, something soft and neutral. I stared at myself in the mirror for a long time, not out of vanity, but as if trying to catch a glimpse of something underneath my skin, something I'd misplaced or forgotten. Later that afternoon, my husband left for a meeting across town. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, the tail lights disappearing into the distance. The silence that followed was immediate, and it rang loud in my ears. I stood at the front door for several minutes after he left, the doorknob still cool under my hand, wondering if this was what freedom felt like, not joy or exhilaration, but stillness, the absence of obligation. I didn't intend to go next door. Not consciously. I tried to keep myself busy, folding towels, wiping down surfaces that didn't need it. But my movements were slow, distracted. I checked my phone once, then again, telling myself I wasn't waiting for a message. And yet I was. By early evening, the sky had shifted to a pale orange, and the fog had finally lifted. I stood in the kitchen again, staring out the window, and I saw him. He was outside, sitting on his back porch with a book resting in his lap, his expression unreadable from the distance. I watched for a few seconds, then turned away, pressing my fingers to the countertop. But I couldn't shake the pull. I couldn't pretend anymore that something inside me hadn't changed, hadn't awakened. I slipped on my shoes and stepped out into the fading light, walking with a calmness that didn't match the noise inside me. When I reached his porch, he looked up, not surprised, just attentive. He didn't move, didn't stand, just waited. I didn't mean to interrupt, I said, standing a few feet from him, my arms crossed over my chest. You're not interrupting. We looked at each other for a moment, neither of us speaking. The silence between us had grown familiar, no longer heavy but layered with meaning. We both knew why I was there. Neither of us needed to say it. I sat down beside him. He closed the book, setting it gently on the table beside him. I didn't ask what he'd been reading, and he didn't offer. The details felt irrelevant. We sat in silence as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the yard. After a few minutes, he turned slightly toward me. Are you okay? It was a simple question, one I had heard 100 times before from people who didn't really want the answer. But when he asked it, I knew he meant it. I hesitated, then nodded. I think so. Maybe. I don't know. He didn't push for more, didn't try to fix anything. He just nodded, like he understood that even uncertainty was a step forward. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to just sit with me in that space, not to rescue me from it, but to witness it. As the last light faded from the sky, a cool breeze passed between us. I shivered slightly, and he offered me the throw blanket folded at the edge of the bench. I accepted it without a word, pulling it over my lap. His hands brushed mine in the exchange, a brief, unintentional contact, but it stayed with me, lingering long after our fingers parted. Time moved strangely on that porch. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full of everything we weren't saying, everything we had already said without words. I felt more seen in that hour than I had in years of conversation inside my own home. Eventually, I stood to leave. I didn't want to overstay, didn't want to make the moment something it wasn't ready to be. He stood too, stepping aside to let me pass. I paused at the edge of the porch, the blanket still draped over my shoulders. "Thank you," I said softly. He nodded. "Anytime." I walked back home in the dark, the air crisp and clean. Each step felt lighter, though my thoughts were anything but. I didn't know what would happen next, didn't know what I wanted to happen. But I knew that I had crossed into something that couldn't be undone. Inside, the house was dim. I turned on a few lamps, letting the warm light fill the rooms. It didn't feel as cold as it had that morning. Maybe it was the blanket, or maybe it was something else, the feeling of having been met where I was, without judgment or demand. I sat in the living room for a while, watching the flicker of the candle I had lit on the coffee table. The silence still hummed around me, but now it wasn't suffocating. It felt like space. Space to think, to feel, to be. When my husband returned later that night, he looked tired. He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, and kissed me on the cheek. I returned the gesture, as I always did. But I noticed something different in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity, or maybe confusion. Maybe he sensed something had shifted. I went upstairs ahead of him, changed into my nightclothes, and climbed into bed. When he joined me, he lay down beside me with a familiar sigh. But something about the way he reached for my hand felt different. Not more affectionate, just more searching, as if he were trying to find something in me that he hadn't looked for in a long time. I let him hold my hand. And I wondered, for the first time, what it would take to be honest with him, completely honest. I didn't have the answer yet. But I was beginning to understand the cost of silence. And it was higher than I had ever imagined. The days blurred into one another. I woke up each morning with a sense of heaviness, the weight of unspoken words hanging over me like a storm cloud. The house was quieter now. My husband still followed his routines, still asked about the groceries or the bills, still kissed me on the cheek when he left for work, but there was a distance between us that neither of us acknowledged. It wasn't new, this distance, but now it felt more real. More permanent. I didn't know how to bridge the gap, how to bring back the intimacy we had once shared. How to find the courage to say everything that had been buried beneath years of neglect and routine. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him the truth, but the words stuck in my throat every time I tried. Instead, I spent more time in the garden, pulling weeds and trimming hedges, the physical work giving me something to focus on, something to do with the tension coiling inside me. The days passed, one after the other, each moment a small piece of the same puzzle I was trying to solve, but the pieces never seemed to fit. Then, one evening, as I was finishing up in the garden, I saw him again. The neighbor. He was standing by the fence, a few feet away from where I was working, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed but purposeful. It was a moment I had known was coming, and yet when it happened, it still felt like a shock. "You've been busy," he said, his voice carrying across the space between us. I straightened up and wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to hide the way my pulse quickened. Just trying to keep busy. He nodded, his gaze flicking over the flowers, the neatly pruned bushes. I get it. You can't run away from everything. The words stung more than they should have. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. I had been running, from the truth, from the life I had built, from everything that had become too heavy to carry. Do you want to talk? He asked, his tone low, almost hesitant. I looked at him, and for the first time in days, I realized I did want to talk. I wanted to say everything I had been keeping inside, wanted to speak the truth that had been building up for so long. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself nodding, as if my body had already made the decision for me. Sure, I said, my voice softer than I meant it to be. He stepped closer to the fence, resting his elbows on the top of it. I don't want to make this harder for you, he said, his voice quiet but steady. But I'm not going to pretend like nothing happened. I looked down at the ground, my fingers curling into the rough soil. I don't know how to deal with this, I admitted. I don't know what to do with it. There was a long pause before he spoke again. I know. I feel the same way. But pretending nothing happened, that's not going to help either of us. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze. His eyes were darker now, not just with concern, but with something else I couldn't name. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I don't know if I can keep pretending, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I don't know if I can keep living like this. He didn't respond immediately. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might say something, offer some solution, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped back, his hands still in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. I get it, he said quietly. You don't have to figure everything out right now. But you should know that you don't have to go through it alone. The words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the promise of being understood, but the realization that I hadn't been truly seen in a long time. Not by my husband. Not by anyone. I'm not asking for anything, he added, his voice steady. I just want you to know that you don't have to carry it by yourself. I looked away, blinking back the sudden rush of emotion that threatened to spill over. I don't know what to do with it, I whispered again, more to myself than to him. He gave me a long, searching look, then nodded, slowly. I know. But you'll figure it out. I didn't know if I would. I didn't know if I could. But there was something in the way he said it, something in the way he looked at me, that made me believe he was right. I would figure it out. In my own time, in my own way. I should go, he said, his voice gentler now. I just wanted to make sure you knew that. I didn't respond, but I didn't need to. I watched him turn and walk back toward his house, his footsteps light against the pavement. And for the first time in days, I felt something shift inside me, a tiny crack in the walls I had built, a small light breaking through the fog. I stood in the garden for a while after he left, my hands resting at my sides, the wind gently tugging at my hair. The sun had set, leaving the sky a deep purple, and the air had grown cooler. But I didn't feel cold anymore. I felt something else. Something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. Hope. It was a strange feeling, one I had almost forgotten. But it was there, steady and sure, growing in the space where fear had once lived. I didn't know what would happen next, or what choices I would make. But I knew that for the first time in a long time, I was ready to start facing the truth. Even if I didn't know what it was yet. When I went inside, my husband was sitting in his chair, reading a book. He looked up when I entered, his expression calm, but there was something in his eyes. A quiet question, perhaps, or maybe just the same distance that had always been there. I walked past him and into the kitchen, my hands shaking slightly as I placed my bag on the counter. The space between us was still there, and I didn't know how to bridge it. But the fact that it existed, the space, the tension, the silence, didn't feel like the end anymore. It felt like the beginning. I didn't speak to him that night. He didn't ask about my day. And when we went to bed, we both fell asleep in the same quiet, predictable rhythm. But the difference was this: I no longer felt trapped by it. I had made the choice to leave that behind. And that was a step. Even if it was small, even if it was just the first one. The morning after I saw him, after everything, I woke up to the sound of birds outside, their song the only thing breaking the silence of the house. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the weight of anxiety pressing down on my chest when I opened my eyes. Instead, there was a strange clarity. Like I had crossed a line I couldn't go back from, and yet, it didn't feel like a loss. I stood up and stretched, feeling the familiar ache in my muscles. The house was quiet, still, almost too still. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, looking at my husband, still asleep. He looked peaceful, unaware of the storm that had been raging in me for days, weeks, months. Maybe even longer. I didn't know how long I stood there, just watching him, my mind filled with questions I wasn't ready to ask. But one thing was clear: I was no longer sure of the path we had been walking together. The silence between us had become a wall, one that neither of us was willing to break. I stepped into the kitchen, letting the warmth of the coffee fill the space around me. I had always found comfort in the morning routine, in the sound of the kettle boiling, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. It was a ritual that anchored me, that kept me grounded when everything else felt uncertain. But today, it didn't feel like enough. I glanced at my phone. A message from him. The neighbor. Hope you're doing okay. Just wanted to check in. It was simple, unassuming, but it made my heart skip a beat. I hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. And yet, a part of me had been waiting for it, for some kind of acknowledgement, some kind of reassurance that I wasn't alone in this feeling, whatever it was. I stood in front of the window, looking out at the street, at the house across the way. I had told myself I wouldn't go back, wouldn't cross that line again. But now, standing there with my phone in my hand, I wasn't so sure anymore. I could feel the weight of the decision hanging over me, the weight of the choice I had been avoiding. The same choice that had been building up inside me for weeks. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. I replied to the message. I'm okay. Just needed some time to think. It wasn't the truth, not entirely. But it was a start. A start toward honesty, toward whatever was waiting for me on the other side of this. I didn't know what it would be, didn't know where it would lead. But I couldn't stay in this in-between place forever. I set the phone down and walked back into the living room, my eyes scanning the room as if looking for something I had misplaced. The house, the life, everything felt like it belonged to someone else. It wasn't mine anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. I had allowed myself to get lost in the role I was playing, to forget who I was beneath the surface. I heard the door open behind me, the sound of footsteps coming down the hallway. My husband appeared in the doorway, his face still sleepy, his eyes squinting against the morning light. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "What's going on?" I turned toward him, trying to smile, but it felt forced. "Not much. Just thinking." He walked over and kissed me on the cheek, a gesture so familiar, so routine, that it almost felt like a habit more than an expression of affection. "Well, I'm off to work. I'll see you later." I nodded. "Have a good day." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice suddenly softer, almost concerned. I met his gaze, and for a brief moment, I felt something stir inside me, a flicker of the connection we used to have. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the realization that it wasn't enough anymore. I wasn't enough. I'm fine, I said, my voice steady, even though I felt anything but. He nodded, looking at me with a mixture of uncertainty and resignation. Okay. I'll be back later. I watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. The house felt even emptier now, quieter, as if his departure had created a space that was impossible to fill. I didn't know what to do with the silence. Didn't know how to fill the space between us that had grown so wide. I picked up my phone again, staring at the message from the neighbor. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to tell myself that nothing had changed, that I had already made my choice. But another part of me, the part that had been quiet for too long, was telling me that I couldn't pretend anymore. I didn't reply immediately. I put the phone down and walked into the bedroom, standing at the window for a long time, looking out at the street below. The world was moving outside, people coming and going, living their lives, while I stood frozen in place, unable to move forward, but too afraid to turn back. I thought about what the neighbor had said, "You're not alone in this." And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. I believed that I wasn't alone, that I didn't have to carry this burden by myself. But the truth was, I had been alone for a long time. I had built this life around myself, around the idea of stability and security, but it had all been a lie. And now, standing in front of the window, I knew I had to face it. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how to fix it, how to make everything right again. But I knew I couldn't stay in this place forever. I had to make a choice. And whatever that choice was, it had to come from me. I reached for my phone again and typed a simple message, "We need to talk." I hit send and sat back, waiting for the reply. Waiting for the next step, the next part of whatever this was becoming. The house was quiet again. But it no longer felt empty. It felt like a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face whatever came next.